What if the man who built his entire life on control suddenly lost it all? Not in a dramatic explosion, but in complete silence. And what if the family he once led simply moved on without him? This story is unfolding right now, and it changes everything. So, if you want the truth before everyone else, hit subscribe right now, because the next reveal will shock you. Cody Brown once stood at the center of what seemed like an unbreakable empire, a larger-than-life figure who believed he had mastered the delicate balance of authority, loyalty, and family unity. But as time moves forward, the illusion begins to quietly unravel in ways that no one could have fully anticipated, because what once looked like strength now feels like isolation, and what once sounded like leadership now echoes as distance and silence. And this transformation is not loud, it is not explosive, it is slow, calculated, and deeply unsettling, because it forces a question that lingers in the mind of every viewer watching closely. What happens when the foundation of control begins to crumble from within? And as this question takes shape, the story pulls you deeper into a world where every action, every choice, and every moment of silence carries more weight than words ever could. Because the truth is no longer being spoken directly, it is being revealed through absence, through missed connections, through conversations that never happen, and through milestones that unfold without acknowledgement. And that is where the real tension begins, because it is not about confrontation, it is about detachment, and that detachment creates a void that grows larger with every passing moment, leaving behind a space filled with unanswered questions and quiet realizations. And as this void expands, the contrast between what was once presented and what is now being experienced becomes impossible to ignore, because the narrative that once focused on unity and togetherness now seems to revolve around independence and separation. And this shift does not come with dramatic announcements, it comes with subtle changes, patterns that slowly emerge until they become impossible to deny. And among these patterns is the growing sense that communication has changed, that messages once answered quickly now go untouched, that attempts to reconnect are met not with resistance, but with silence. And that silence speaks louder than any argument ever could, because it signals a decision, one that is firm, intentional, and difficult to reverse. And as this realization settles in, another layer begins to unfold, one that suggests this is not a temporary phase, but a lasting transformation. And that idea adds a deeper level of suspense, because it raises the stakes, turning every interaction into something significant, every moment into a potential turning point. And yet, despite this tension, there's also a sense of calm, a quiet confidence in the way the children appear to be moving forward, building lives that no longer depend on approval or validation. And this independence becomes the defining theme of the story, creating a powerful contrast with the image of control that once dominated the narrative. And as these two forces continue to pull in opposite directions, the distance between them grows wider, forming a divide that feels less like a gap and more like a complete shift in direction. And within this shift, the idea of a silent understanding begins to take shape, a shared awareness among the children that does not need to be spoken aloud, because it is reflected in their actions, in their choices, and in their willingness to move forward without looking back. And this understanding creates a sense of unity that is different from what existed before. It is not based on structure or hierarchy, it is based on mutual respect and shared experience. And that makes it far more resilient, because it does not rely on a central figure to hold it together. It exists on its own, sustained by the individuals who choose to be part of it. And as this new form of connection strengthens, the old structure continues to weaken, creating a dynamic that feels both inevitable and unresolved. Because while one side adapts and evolves, the other remains focused on reclaiming what has already changed. And this tension between adaptation and resistance becomes the driving force of the narrative, pulling viewers deeper into the story as they try to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening and what it means for the future. And as these questions continue to build, the story loops back to its core theme: the illusion of control versus the reality of independence. And within that loop, the suspense is renewed because the outcome remains uncertain, leaving the audience watching closely for any sign of resolution, any moment that might shift the direction of the story once again. And yet, even as this anticipation grows, there is a sense that the answer may not come in the form of reconciliation or return, but in the continued evolution of lives that are moving forward regardless of what is left behind. And that possibility adds a layer of depth that keeps the narrative compelling because it suggests that the true story is not about what has been lost, but about what is being created in its place. And as this idea takes hold, the focus shifts away from the past and toward the present, highlighting the choices being made, the paths being taken, and the new realities being formed. And in doing so, it reinforces the idea that the story is far from over. It is still unfolding, still evolving, and still filled with moments that have the power to surprise, to challenge, and to redefine everything that came before. And as the narrative continues to circle back on itself, the loop becomes clear: a cycle of expectation and change, of control and release, of connection and distance that keeps repeating in different forms, each time revealing something new, and each time drawing the viewer further into a story that refuses to settle into a single conclusion, because it is not meant to end. It is meant to continue, to shift, to grow, and to reflect the complexities of relationships that cannot be simplified or contained. And it is within this ongoing movement that the true power of the story lies, a power that keeps the audience engaged, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet intensity of transformation and the unspoken understanding that sometimes the most significant changes are the ones that happen without a single word being said. As the story continues to unfold, the tension does not rely on loud confrontations or dramatic declarations. Instead, it builds through patterns that become impossible to ignore, and through choices that quietly reshape the entire dynamic. Because what once felt like a unified structure now appears to be a collection of independent paths, each moving forward with its own direction, its own priorities, and its own sense of purpose. And this shift is not chaotic, it is deliberate. And that is what makes it so compelling, because it suggests that every step being taken is intentional, every boundary being set is meaningful, and every moment of silence is part of a larger, unspoken understanding that continues to guide the narrative forward. And as these patterns become clearer, another layer of intrigue begins to take shape, one that centers around the idea of communication, or more specifically, the absence of it. Because when communication changes, everything else follows. And in this case, the change is not subtle, it is profound. Messages that once carried urgency now seem to dissolve into quiet spaces. Calls that once connected now go unanswered, and attempts to bridge the growing distance appear to lose their momentum before they can even begin. And this creates a loop that reinforces itself again and again, a cycle where effort meets silence and silence leads to more distance. And as this cycle continues, it becomes less about temporary conflict and more about permanent transformation, because patterns repeated over time begin to define reality, and that reality is what viewers are now watching unfold in real time. And within this evolving landscape, individual moments start to carry more weight because they offer glimpses into lives that are no longer centered around the same axis. Milestones, achievements, and personal developments begin to surface, each one highlighting a level of independence that feels both empowering and final, because it shows that progress is happening regardless of whether it is acknowledged by everyone involved. And this independence is not just physical, it is emotional, it is psychological, and it represents a shift in mindset that cannot easily be reversed. because once someone begins to build a life on their own terms, it becomes increasingly difficult to return to a structure that no longer aligns with that growth. And as this realization deepens, the narrative takes on a new dimension, one that is less about what is being lost and more about what is being created. Because while one side of the story focuses on absence and unanswered questions, the other side is filled with movement, exploration, and new opportunities. And this contrast becomes one of the most powerful elements of the entire situation, because it highlights two completely different experiences unfolding simultaneously, one rooted in the past and one focused entirely on the future. And as these experiences continue to diverge, the distance between them grows wider, creating a separation that feels less like a temporary phase and more like a defining characteristic of the new reality. And within this separation, the idea of control begins to lose its meaning, because control requires participation, it requires connection, and it requires a shared understanding of roles and expectations. And when those elements are no longer present, the concept itself begins to fade, leaving behind something that looks very different from what once existed. And this shift is both subtle and significant, because it does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually through a series of decisions that build on each other until the end result becomes undeniable. And as this process continues, the narrative becomes increasingly centered around the idea of choice, the choice to engage or not, to respond or not, to return or to move forward. And each of these choices carries weight because they shape the direction of the story in ways that cannot be undone. And this is where the suspense reaches another level, because it is no longer about predicting a single outcome. It is about understanding a series of possibilities, each one influenced by the decisions being made in the present. And as viewers try to piece together these possibilities, the story continues to loop back on itself, revisiting the same core themes from different angles, each time adding new layers of meaning and complexity. And this looping structure is what keeps the narrative engaging, because it creates a sense of familiarity while also allowing for constant evolution. And as each new development unfolds, it feels. And just like that, the empire built on control fades into silence while the next generation rises stronger without it. And if you want more real stories that expose what is really happening, hit subscribe right now, because the next update is coming sooner than you think. Both expected and surprising at the same time, reinforcing the idea that while the direction may be clear, the details are still unfolding. And that uncertainty is what holds attention, because it leaves room for interpretation, for speculation, and for the possibility that something unexpected could shift the entire trajectory at any moment. And yet, even within this uncertainty, there is a sense of stability in the way the independent paths continue to move forward, because progress does not appear to be slowing down. If anything, it is gaining momentum, creating a narrative that feels increasingly focused on growth rather than reconciliation. And that focus changes the tone of the story in a way that is both subtle and profound, because it shifts attention away from what could be restored and toward what is being built in its place. And as this new focus takes hold, the original structure begins to feel more distant, more like a memory than a current reality. And this perception adds another layer of depth to the narrative, because it suggests that the transformation is not only external, but internal as well, affecting the way each person sees their role, their relationships, and their future. And as these internal shifts continue to align with external actions, the story moves further away from its starting point, creating a trajectory that feels both inevitable and unresolved. And it is within this balance between inevitability and uncertainty that the true power of the narrative exists, because it keeps viewers engaged not by providing clear answers, but by presenting a series of evolving questions that invite continuous attention and reflection. And as the story loops once more back to its central themes, the contrast between control and independence, between expectation and reality, becomes even more pronounced, highlighting the ongoing tension that drives the entire narrative forward, and ensuring that each new development feels like a continuation of something larger, rather than an isolated moment. And this continuity is what gives the story its lasting impact, because it transforms individual events into parts of a broader journey, one that is still unfolding and one that continues to capture attention with every new turn. And just like that, the empire built on control fades into silence while the next generation rises